I wish I could tell you there was a single moment, a clean before and after, a dramatic turning point where I could point at the calendar and say, there, that's the day my marriage changed. But it didn't happen like that. It happened the way a leak happens. Quiet, slow. At first, it's just a drip you ignore because you're busy. Then one day, you step into a puddle in your socks and realize you've been pretending the ceiling wasn't falling apart. If you asked my wife, she'd say nothing happened. And that's the problem. Nothing happening became the whole thing. It started with little gaps. A night here, a week there. Not even coldness, really. We still laughed. We still watched shows. We still argued about stupid things like whether the dishwasher should be loaded logically or artistically, which is what my wife calls stacking plates like a Jenga tower. She still kissed me goodbye in the morning. A quick kiss, efficient, like stamping a document. And I told myself, this is adulthood. This is normal. People get tired. People get busy. People have stress. I even felt proud of myself for being understanding. Because men are supposed to be simple creatures, right? We're supposed to be happy if there's food in the fridge and a TV remote in the house. Wanting anything beyond that is apparently a sign you need spiritual growth. The first night I actually noticed it, really noticed it, wasn't some charged, emotional moment. It was painfully ordinary. We'd had dinner, we'd cleaned up, we'd scrolled on our phones in that peaceful silence couples pretend is comfort, when really it's just two people sharing the same Wi-Fi. We went to bed. Lights off. Same routine. Same room. Same bodies in the same space. I reached for her the way I always had. Not like a teenager. Not like a desperate man who'd been locked in a cave. Just a hand on her side. A small pull. A wordless, hey, I'm here. She gently moved my hand away. Not irritated. Not dramatic. Gentle. Like I'd reached for a hot pan and she was saving me from getting burned. I think we focus too much on physical things, she said. That sentence sounded prepared. Not rehearsed like a lie. Rehearsed like a belief. Like she'd said it to herself enough times that it became a truth. I chuckled because I thought it was a joke. The kind where you roll your eyes and say, okay, philosopher. She didn't laugh. We have such a strong connection, she continued, calm as a yoga instructor. Why reduce it to that? Reduce. That word hit me weird, like she'd just taken something that mattered to me and described it as a low-grade hobby. Like I'd asked her to help me reorganize my comic book collection. I stared at the ceiling and did that thing men do when we don't want to start an argument at night. I swallowed it. Okay, I said. Because what do you say to someone who's speaking in quotes from a self-help book? If you push back, you sound like the villain, the shallow guy, the caveman who only thinks about one thing. And I didn't want to be that guy. So I played my part. I rolled over. I told myself it was temporary, that we'd had a weird week, that work had been stressful, that maybe she wasn't feeling well. And for a few days, I convinced myself it was nothing. Except nothing has a way of repeating itself. A week went by. 2. Another gentle redirection. Another calm sentence that sounded smarter than it felt. It wasn't rejection with anger. It was rejection with logic. And logic is harder to argue with because you can't say, hey, your logic hurts my feelings, without sounding ridiculous. Eventually, I tried to talk about it. Not a confrontation, not a demand. I did what every man does when he's trying to be careful. I turned it into a soft, emotional sentence that wouldn't scare anyone. I've just been feeling a bit distant lately, I said one evening while we were putting away groceries. I chose the moment strategically. No bed, no mood, no obvious agenda. Just two adults handling bananas and almond milk like responsible citizens. I miss being close. I didn't even look at her while I said it. I stared into the fridge like the answer might be behind the lettuce. She sighed. Not a big sigh, not a movie sigh. A controlled sigh. Just enough to communicate fatigue, like I'd asked her to explain taxes. Most husbands don't think like that, she said. I actually paused with my hand on a carton of eggs. Because I didn't know what to do with that. Not, I don't feel the same. Not, I'm struggling. Not, I need time. Just, most husbands don't. So now there was a category. And I wasn't in it. It was like being told you're the only person who still eats cereal with a fork. Not illegal. Just wrong in a socially embarrassing way. What do you mean? I asked, still calm, still careful, still trying not to become that guy. She shrugged, like the meaning was obvious. You put too much meaning into it, she said. It's not how stable relationships work. Stable. Another power word. Stable sounded like, you're childish. Stable sounded like, grow up. Stable sounded like, why can't you be like other men? I didn't argue. I nodded. I asked one or two gentle follow-up questions, and each one was met with more of the same calm tone. This faint, disappointed patience, like she was dealing with a toddler who wanted candy for dinner. Then she ended it with the sentence that always ends these conversations. Can we not make this a thing? And that's where the trap was. Because if I kept talking, I was making it a thing. If I stopped talking, I was being mature. So I stopped. That night, I did what every modern man does when he doesn't trust his own reality anymore. I consulted the sacred oracle, Google. I searched things like, long-term couples, closeness changes, is it normal to want connection after years together? How often do married couples stay affectionate? Why do I feel needy in my marriage? The internet did what it always does. It gave me 20 different answers, all written by people who either had a PhD or had a crystal collection. Nothing said I was crazy. Nothing said I was abnormal, which should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me feel worse. Because if I wasn't crazy, then why did I feel like I needed permission to want something basic? After that, the pattern locked in. I'd try to bring it up carefully, like I was handling fragile glass. She'd answer with exhaustion. Why is this always about you? I thought we were past this. You're making me feel like I'm failing. That last one was particularly brilliant, because now my feelings weren't just inconvenient, they were harmful. So I learned, quickly. If I tried to initiate any closeness at the wrong moment, she'd shift away and say something like, I'm tired. But with the subtext, don't start. If I tried to talk about it, she'd stare at me like I'd just ruined the evening for no reason. I started timing my own existence. If she was stressed, I shouldn't bring it up. If she had a headache, I shouldn't bring it up. If she had a good day, I shouldn't bring it up because why ruin it? It's amazing how fast you can train a person to shut up when you attach consequences to simple honesty. And the consequences weren't yelling. That's the part people don't understand. It wasn't dramatic. It was atmosphere, a coldness, a silence, a withdrawal of warmth that made you feel like you'd stepped on a social landmine. So I adapted. I stopped reaching for her at night, stopped lingering too close on the couch, stopped kissing longer than 1 second because I didn't want to be suggestive. I even stopped complimenting her body because I didn't want it to sound like I valued her for the wrong reasons. I became a monk with a mortgage. And the wild thing is, she seemed happier. She smiled more. She was lighter. Like removing my desire from the room made the air cleaner. At some point, after a few weeks of me staying quiet, she patted my arm, actually patted like you'd pat a dog, and said, "Thank you for being understanding." Understanding what exactly? That sentence stuck in my head for days, because it wasn't, "Thank you for being patient while I figure things out." It wasn't, "Thank you for giving me space." It was understanding, like she'd explained a scientific fact to me, and I'd finally stopped arguing with gravity. And I remember lying awake later, staring at the ceiling, realizing something that made my stomach turn a little. I wasn't being understanding. I was being trained, and I still didn't say anything, because I didn't want to sound like one of those husbands who thinks like that. A few weeks later, we had dinner with her friends. Not a celebration, not a birthday. Just one of those casual evenings people like to call easy, even though nothing involving shared opinions has ever been easy in the history of humanity. I actually liked her friends. That matters. They weren't cartoon villains. They were smart, confident, well-spoken. The kind of people who read articles instead of headlines and use words like context and growth in everyday conversation. They arrived with wine and good moods, complimented the apartment, asked about work, laughed at the right moments. Everything looked normal. That's what made it dangerous. We cooked together, or rather, my wife cooked and I assisted in ways that wouldn't get me corrected. I chopped vegetables. I stirred. I stayed useful but invisible. Years of marriage teach you this skill naturally. At the table, the conversation floated from topic to topic. Travel, mutual acquaintances, a new place downtown that was apparently a must. At some point, one of her friends sighed and said, "Honestly, people have such unrealistic expectations from relationships." That sentence alone didn't mean anything. It could have gone anywhere. Another friend nodded. Especially long-term ones. I kept eating. I'd learned that staying quiet was safer than trying to anticipate where conversations might land. My wife smiled into her glass, and then, very casually, very gently, she said, "Some people put a lot of pressure on closeness. Not you, not him. Some people." She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. The sentence was already walking in my direction. One of her friends tilted her head sympathetically toward my wife. "Oh yeah," she said, "men who are emotionally mature don't really need that much." She didn't whisper it. She didn't hesitate. She stated it like she was reminding everyone that water is wet. I smiled. Automatically. That polite smile you use when you're not sure if you've just been insulted or educated. "That's interesting," I said. "Is there a chart?" They laughed. Not cruelly. Worse, indulgently. Another friend leaned back in her chair, wine in hand. "Honestly, we've been together for years, and it's never been a big focus. A big focus, like a hobby, like collecting stamps, like something optional you outgrow once you've reached a higher level." Everyone nodded. I looked at my wife. She was quiet, calm, relaxed, almost relieved. That silence was doing a lot of work. It was the kind of silence that says, "Yes, this is exactly what I've been trying to tell you." The kind that lets other people speak for you while keeping your hands clean. "You know," another one added, "when someone keeps bringing it up, it can feel like pressure." Pressure. There it was again. The word that turns someone's need into a violation. My wife finally spoke, softly, carefully. "That's how it feels sometimes. Sometimes. Not always. Not constantly. Just enough to sound fair." I opened my mouth. Closed it again. Because what do you say when three people are calmly agreeing that something you feel is immature? You don't argue. You don't defend yourself. You start adjusting. Someone changed the subject after that. Weekend plans, work gossip, a mutual friend who was toxic but in a fascinating way. Everyone moved on, except I didn't. The rest of the evening I felt like I'd been quietly reassigned from husband to case study. Like if I spoke too much, someone might take notes. After they left and we started cleaning up, my wife stacked plates in the sink, artistically, which meant I'd have to reorganize them later if I wanted the dishwasher to close. She leaned against the counter and said, "See? It's not just me." There it was. The verdict. "I didn't really say anything," I replied. "You didn't need to," she said. "They get it." That word again, get it. I nodded, because nodding had become a reflex. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the dinner in my head, not angrily, analytically, like I was trying to find the exact moment I'd failed an exam I didn't know I was taking. I started doing comparisons. Other husbands don't need this. Other men don't bring it up. Other people don't feel unsettled by absence. I wondered when I'd become other. After that evening, the rules became clearer. Not written, not spoken out loud, just understood. If I reached out at the wrong moment, she'd subtly move away. No words, just a shift, like someone changing seats on a bus. If I lingered too long, she'd check her phone. If I said nothing, she seemed lighter, happier. Silence, I learned, was attractive. At some point, she said something that locked everything into place. "If you bring it up," she said one night while brushing her teeth, "it pushes me away." She said it casually, like she was telling me caffeine keeps her up at night. No anger, no threat, just cause and effect. So now the topic itself was the problem, not the distance, not the lack, the mention. I nodded, obviously, because once someone frames your honesty as harm, the only moral option left is quiet. From then on, every word became a calculation. If I said nothing, I was respectful. If I said something, I was applying pressure. It was a perfect system. And the worst part? It worked. After that, I became quiet. Not sulky, not dramatic. Quiet in a disciplined way. The kind of quiet that feels mature from the outside and hollow from the inside. I stopped initiating anything that could be misinterpreted. Stopped reaching out in bed. I learned the exact distance that felt safe. Close enough to look normal. Far enough to avoid consequences. It was like living next to a wild animal that only bites if you make sudden movements. At first, I told myself this was temporary, that I was just giving her space, being respectful, doing the right thing. But then I noticed something unsettling. She didn't seem to miss anything. In fact, she seemed lighter. She laughed more, slept better, moved through the apartment like someone whose background noise had finally been turned off. Meanwhile, I started editing myself. I'd catch a thought halfway through and shut it down. Don't say that. Don't look too long. Don't touch like that. Even compliments became risky. You look nice today, felt acceptable. You look beautiful, felt suspicious. Anything beyond that felt like I was crossing an invisible line. Once, I kissed her a little longer than usual before leaving for work. Nothing dramatic, just half a second more. She stiffened slightly. Not enough to call it a reaction, just enough to make me notice. Later that evening, she said casually, "You seemed a bit intense this morning." Intense. I apologized. I didn't even know what for exactly, but the apology came out smoothly. Practiced. "Sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." She smiled, reassuring, gentle. "I know," she said. "I just need you to be mindful." Mindful. That word followed me everywhere after that. Be mindful of her energy. Be mindful of timing. Be mindful of how things feel to her. There was no equivalent mindfulness for me. Eventually, she started using a different kind of language. Softer, smarter, the language of therapy. "You're very focused on validation," she said one evening after I tried, very carefully, to explain why the distance felt heavy sometimes. "I think you confuse closeness with worth." She said it kindly. That was the most impressive part, like she was diagnosing a minor vitamin deficiency. "I don't think this is healthy," she added. Healthy. I nodded again. Because what do you do when someone reframes your feelings as a condition? You don't argue with diagnoses. You accept them. I started watching myself through her eyes. Every time I felt that familiar pull toward her, I asked myself, is this need or is this insecurity? Every time I felt lonely, I wondered if I was just failing to self-regulate. I began thanking her for things I'd never needed to thank anyone for before. Thanks for being patient with me. Thanks for understanding. Thanks for not getting annoyed. One night, after I'd stayed quiet for days, she reached out and squeezed my hand. "There," she said. "This is nice. This feels safe." Safe. I smiled. Inside, something folded in on itself. Because safety, apparently, meant neutrality, stillness, absence of desire. I started feeling embarrassed by myself. Not in a dramatic way, in small, private moments. Standing in the shower thinking, why am I like this? Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering why something so basic felt so forbidden. I caught myself censoring jokes, censoring looks, censoring entire parts of my personality, that might imply wanting too much. I wasn't rejected anymore. I was preemptively rejecting myself. And the strangest part was how reasonable it all sounded. If I ever felt frustrated, I reminded myself, she doesn't owe you anything. If I felt hurt, I told myself, this is about growth, about maturity. If I felt distant, I blamed my expectations. I wasn't being asked to change. I was being asked to disappear, quietly, politely, and with emotional awareness. And I did. For a while. At some point, I did something I hadn't done in months. I stopped asking myself if I was broken and started asking whether I was being lied to. Not by her, by the idea. So I talked to men, not dramatically. Not in a support group circle where everyone holds coffee like a shield. Just conversations. At work, between meetings, in hallways. The kind of talks men have when no one's recording and no one's trying to sound evolved. It started with Mark. Mark is married, 2 kids, permanently tired, permanently sarcastic. The kind of guy who treats work emails like personal attacks. We were standing near the coffee machine, the good one, the one that pretends to be Italian. So, I said casually, like I was asking about weather patterns. How are things at home? Mark snorted. Define things. I hesitated, then just said it. Do you ever feel like closeness disappears and you're just supposed to accept it as growth? He stared at me, then laughed. Who told you that? I shrugged. Just wondering. No, he said immediately. That's not how it works. That was it. No lecture, no philosophy, just no. We have ups and downs, he continued, filling his mug. Sometimes work gets in the way, sometimes life does. But if I told my wife I didn't miss being close to her at all, she'd think I was having a stroke. That image stuck with me. Later that day, I talked to Daniel. Older, married longer, calm guy. The kind who never raises his voice. I phrased it differently this time. Does it ever just vanish? And you're told it's maturity? Daniel frowned. Who's telling you that? I was starting to notice a pattern. No, he said slowly. It changes, sure. But vanish? And then you're blamed for noticing? That sounds like something else. Something else. Not normal. Not most husbands. Something else. I didn't tell them details. I didn't need to. Just hearing men say no without hesitation felt grounding. Like someone finally handed me a ruler and said, here, measure reality. For weeks, I'd been comparing myself to an invisible standard. Turns out, the standard didn't exist. That was the first crack. Around the same time, I started noticing things at home that I'd either ignored or explained away before. My wife laughed easily with other people. Not a polite laugh. Not the careful one she used with me sometimes. A real one. Loose. Effortless. She'd come home from dinners energized, talking about conversations, quoting jokes. One evening, she stood in the kitchen texting, smiling at her phone. Who's that? I asked. A friend, she said. We were talking about work. Her tone was light, open, relaxed. I nodded. A few weeks earlier, I would have felt a familiar tightening in my chest. That reflexive guilt. Don't read into it. Don't be insecure. This time, something else happened. Nothing dramatic. Just observation. She had warmth. She had ease. She had emotional availability. Just not with me. I started noticing how often the rules shifted depending on direction. If she leaned into someone else's attention, it was harmless. If I noticed, it was overthinking. If I asked, it was pressure. Once at a small gathering, I watched her touch another man's arm while laughing. A casual, friendly gesture. Nothing outrageous. Later that night, I mentioned it. Not accusingly. Almost joking. You seemed pretty animated tonight. Her expression changed instantly. Why are you doing that? She asked. Doing what? Turning everything into something, she said. You promised you wouldn't. Promised. I didn't remember making that promise. I was just making an observation, I said. Well, it feels like you're framing it, she replied. And that makes me uncomfortable. There it was again. Her comfort. My silence. Hollow. Because suddenly I could see the shape of it. The rules weren't about balance, they weren't about growth, they were about direction. She was allowed emotional freedom. I was allowed restraint. She could explore, I could adapt. She could define reality, I could accept it. One night, lying in bed, I asked the question I'd been carefully avoiding. So, is this just how it is now? I kept my voice neutral. No edge, no accusation. I even stared at the ceiling to avoid looking confrontational. She didn't answer right away. Then she sighed. "Why do you need labels?" she said. "Why do you always need to define things?" I waited. "You're pressuring again," she added. "Can we not dissect everything?" There it was. The loop. I nodded. But something had shifted. I didn't feel ashamed. I didn't feel guilty. I felt cold. Not angry. Clear. Because I finally understood something simple. If asking what something is considered pressure, then the answer is already decided. That night, for the first time, I didn't lie awake wondering what was wrong with me. I lay there wondering something else entirely. How long had I been the only one required to disappear? And once you see that, you can't unsee it. After that, I stopped trying to fix anything. Not because I gave up, because I finally understood what I was being asked to fix. It wasn't behavior, it wasn't timing, it wasn't communication, it was me. Or rather, my presence as someone who wanted something. Once that realization settled in, everything else became painfully clear. I stopped asking questions and I started watching. One evening, after she came home energized from meeting friends, I asked, calmly, neutrally, "Do you ever miss what we used to have?" I didn't frame it as blame. I didn't even look hurt. I just asked. She paused. Not confused. Not surprised. Measured. "I think you romanticize the past," she said. "This is what mature relationships look like." There it was. Not a feeling. A doctrine. "So this is permanent?" I asked. I kept my voice steady. I wasn't fishing. I genuinely wanted to know. She frowned. "Why do you need labels? Why does everything have to be defined? You're doing that thing again. You should be grateful for what you get," she added, not harshly, not kindly, just factually, like she was reminding me of a policy. That sentence landed differently, not because it was cruel, but because it was final. Grateful implies charity. Charity implies hierarchy. I nodded, out of reflex. But something inside me stayed still. For the first time, I didn't rush to interpret her words generously. I didn't soften them. I didn't translate them into something easier to swallow. I heard them exactly as they were. She wasn't telling me to wait. She wasn't asking for patience. She was explaining my position. And suddenly, all the earlier moments lined up perfectly. It was never about distance. It was never about phases. It was about control through moral framing. My needs weren't denied. They were reclassified as immaturity, as insecurity, as pressure. Once you do that, you don't have to argue anymore. You just let the person talk themselves into disappearance. That night, lying next to her, I realized something that should have terrified me. I wasn't afraid of losing her. I was afraid of continuing to erase myself just to stay. And that fear was smaller, manageable. I thought back to all the apologies, all the nodding, all the times I'd thanked her for tolerating something that shouldn't have required tolerance. I hadn't been asking for more. I'd been asking not to be diminished. And the answer had been very consistent. That's when I knew. Not emotionally, not dramatically, logically. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be resolved. It was a structure. They change when someone steps out. I planned the conversation. Not the dramatic version people imagine, where someone rehearses speeches in front of a mirror. I planned it the way you plan something once you're tired of improvising your own humiliation. I waited until I knew exactly what I wanted to say. And more importantly, what I wasn't going to say anymore. No disclaimers, no softening, no apologizing for existing. What finally pushed me there wasn't anger. It was disgust. Not toward her, toward myself. I didn't recognize the man I'd become, the one who measured every word, the one who apologized preemptively, the one who kept explaining his own thoughts like they needed a disclaimer. I'd never been that man, and I wasn't going to finish my life as him. So I picked a night, quiet, ordinary, no stress, no distractions, no excuses. I sat down across from her at the kitchen table. "We need to talk," I said. She looked wary, but not alarmed. "Okay," she said. "About what?" "About us," I replied. "And where this is going." She exhaled slowly. "Can you not make this heavy?" "I'm done making it light," I said. "That's kind of the point." She crossed her arms. "I'm not okay with how things are," I continued. "And I'm not okay with the idea that wanting closeness makes me immature, selfish, or defective." Her expression hardened. "I never said you were defective. You didn't need to," I said calmly. "You just made it the only logical conclusion." She shook her head. "You're exaggerating again." "No," I said. "I'm being precise." I leaned forward slightly. Not aggressive, intentional. "I'm not here to argue about who's right," I said. "I'm here to figure out whether we're actually going to fix this, or whether I'm supposed to keep disappearing so you can stay comfortable." Her voice sharpened. "So what, you're giving me an ultimatum?" "I'm stating reality," I said. "If nothing changes, if this stays exactly how it is, I'm leaving." The silence that followed was thick. Then her face changed. The calm dropped. "Oh, so that's it?" she snapped. "You threaten to walk out unless I become someone else?" "I didn't threaten," I said. "I explained the outcome." She stood up abruptly. "Fine," she said. "You want to leave? Leave." She walked into the bedroom. I followed slowly. She yanked the closet door open and dragged out a suitcase, slamming it onto the bed. "Here," she said, grabbing clothes. "I'll make it easy for you." She started throwing things in, not packing, throwing, shirts, pants, socks, fast, aggressive, performative. "This is what you want, right?" she said. "So go, get out." I watched her for a moment. I'd seen this before. This wasn't a breakup. This was a bluff wrapped in chaos. She wasn't ending the marriage. She was forcing me to retreat. She expected panic, regret, backtracking. She expected me to soften. She expected me to say, "I didn't mean it like that. I didn't." "Stop," I said. "I'll pack my own things," I continued calmly. "You don't get to turn this into a scene." She stared at me, confused now. "You're really doing this?" she asked. "You're actually leaving?" "I'm doing exactly what I said I would," I replied. "Because I meant it." She scoffed. "This is ridiculous. You'll come back once you cool off." I shook my head. "That's the thing," I said. "I'm not heated. I'm clear." Her voice rose again. "All this because you can't accept how relationships change?" "No," I said. "Because I won't accept being told that wanting closeness makes me less than." She laughed, sharp and bitter. "You're throwing everything away," she said. "No," I replied. "I'm done throwing myself away." She stopped moving. I packed slowly, methodically, no rush. Each item felt like an act of reclaiming something I'd given up piece by piece. When I zipped the suitcase, the sound felt final, not dramatic, just definitive. She watched me, waiting, still waiting for the moment I'd break. It didn't come. "So that's it?" she asked. "Yes," I said. I picked up the suitcase and walked past her. She didn't follow, because part of her still believed I'd turn around. I didn't. I didn't leave feeling heroic. I left with a suitcase that wasn't full and a head that finally was. The first weeks were strange, quiet in a way that wasn't empty, just unfamiliar. I slept better than I expected, worse than I hoped. Some nights I woke up reaching for a phone I no longer needed to check. We didn't talk much after that. She sent a few messages at first, practical ones. cold ones. Then a longer one, explaining how everything escalated unnecessarily and how she never meant it to go that far. I read it twice and noticed something important. It still wasn't about me, so I didn't reply. At work, people noticed I was different before they knew why. Less careful, less filtered, like someone who had stopped monitoring his own posture. I didn't tell a dramatic version of the story. I didn't need to. When men asked why it ended, I said, "We wanted different things." And for the first time, that sentence actually meant something. Sometimes I missed her. Sometimes I missed the idea of her. Sometimes I just missed being someone's default person. But I never missed apologizing for wanting to be close. I never missed explaining myself into smaller and smaller shapes. Months later, I realized something quietly comforting. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at her. Not at myself. I could finally tell the difference between compromise and erasure. I didn't leave because I wasn't loved enough. I left because loving me required permission, and I stopped asking for it. They didn't convince me I was wrong. They convinced me I had no place in her life. And once you understand that, moving on doesn't feel like loss. It feels like returning to yourself. If you felt this story hit hard, drop a like, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps Steelheart beating.